Hi there. I've been thinking. So, according to the history books, the Enlightenment is an intellectual and philosophical movement that took place in the 17th and 18th century. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm still waiting for it to really kick in. Because it really doesn't seem as if we're living in particularly enlightened times. During this video, I want to consider some of the main elements of the Enlightenment period, the Enlightenment movement, and think about them in terms of today's society, the issues we face, and so on. The particular themes that I want to consider are reason as the primary source of authority and legitimacy, liberty, particularly personal liberty, including things like the freedom of expression, democracy, progress, and tolerance. So let's take a look at each of those things one at a time. During the Enlightenment, reason began to replace faith as the main source of authority in terms of knowledge. So no longer were we required to depend upon an external source of information, a divine revelation, the Word of God, for our understanding of the world. Instead, we were to use our own reasoning powers to understand the world. So some of the methods that accompany that are principally those of the scientific method. So there was observation, um, there was experimentation, trial and error, the experimental method. All of these processes began to assume a greater authority in terms of human knowledge than simply a source of revelation. So, for example, it wasn't enough if, say, the Bible said that the world was flat, which it doesn't, but if it did, if our observation of the world and if our experimentation regarding the world suggested otherwise, then we would use our reasoning powers to understand that the world was actually spherical and not flat. So, in terms of authority, reason began to replace the Bible or any other source of revelation in terms of our knowledge. This is particularly important. I mean, it led to so much of our current scientific advancement and development. It's been very successful. Of course, science doesn't always get everything right, but that's part of the process of science itself, that in getting things wrong, it's able to ask the right questions and move forward to the next venture. So there's nothing, it's not a problem when science is wrong. It is, of course, a problem when science doesn't admit it's wrong, and sometimes there's that inertia, that human reluctance to admit that they've been wrong. But eventually, science will actually recognize that what it previously held to be true was not completely true. It doesn't mean that things are completely overthrown. It does mean that there's a shift in thinking and that there are more detailed nuances to what was believed or understood before. These days, we're tending to see something of a reaction against reason and science. On the one hand, you get faith trying to reassert itself, trying to say that our reason is unreliable, that we need an external authority, a divine authority of some sort, that that's the real source of truth, and that human reason is fallible. Of course, human reason is fallible. That's not an excuse to ignore it. On the other hand, we're also getting a push from a sort of individualism, which has developed more in the social age, the age of social media, when people feel free to express their opinion about things, which is fine, but opinion is mistaken for knowledge. Now, we're all entitled to our own opinion, of course, But if I'm asked to choose between the opinion of someone who has studied the subject in depth for many, many years, who've published a lot of peer reviewed papers on the subject, who've dedicated their life to that subject, and that of someone who's just watched a 10-minute YouTube video on the subject, then I'm going to choose the expert every time. So the reaction against reason and science and expertise is not going to take us to a good place. Personal liberty is one theme of the Enlightenment that is perhaps emphasized in some particular areas of society today above most others. And it's also the one that's perhaps the most problematic, or one of the most problematic anyway. Personal liberty always has to be balanced against the needs of society. If we're going to have a society in which people cooperate to advance the mutual good, then some personal liberties are going to have to be sacrificed. We do that quite freely in some areas, but we struggle to do that within others. And it's always an area that causes difficulties. Freedom of expression, freedom of speech is one obvious example of that. Some people would want to have that completely unlimited, for people to be able to say whatever they want to say. Many people, though, I think, want freedom to be able to say what they want to say, and maybe not so much for other people. And maybe that's the case with liberty in general, that we want it for ourselves in the areas that we consider important, but maybe not so much in other areas that may affect us. Now, there's always got to be compromise in this. It's always going to be a difficult question to answer, where personal liberty must be limited to serve the greater good. But it's something we do have to wrestle with, and do, in fact, wrestle with all the time. I don't think an argument can be made for absolute personal liberty at all, unless we want to descend into complete anarchy. And I suspect that even complete anarchy would end up with a certain number of rules to guide it. So some personal liberty would even be lost in that. So it's not an absolute. Freedom of speech is not an absolute, but maintaining the balance, trying to find this, to strike the right balance between the good of society and personal liberty, is one that we're going to have to wrestle with. It's an issue we're going to have to wrestle with forever. Democracy is another problematic area, isn't it? And it's one that seems to be losing ground again today. Now, the concept of democracy is, of course, much, much older than the period of the Enlightenment, but it was during the period of the Enlightenment that it really came to the fore. The idea of government of the people, by the people, for the people. Now, often that the concept of people was somewhat limited. For example, it probably didn't include those, strangely coloured people. It didn't include those people without male genitalia. So democracy has struggled to find its true expression, and it struggles today. Uh, it's a difficult form of government. It's not one form of government, and what we sometimes call democracy is really only a partial democracy, I think. The idea that we become democratic every 3 or 4 years, depending on what your political system happens to be, when we hold elections, is only a very limited form of democracy, I think, a sort of representational democracy that only expresses itself occasionally. Much more participatory forms of democracy are possible, particularly in smaller societies, by the use of things such as citizens initiated referenda. We have referenda here in Australia occasionally to change the constitution, and they almost invariably fail because they require more than a simple majority, and people are inherently conservative. A society like Switzerland has many, many more citizens initiated referenda, and they are more successful there. But it's a much smaller society, and perhaps it works better in a smaller society. We haven't really yet, I think, found a system of democracy that works very well. We'll never find one that works perfectly, that's obvious. It's another area where compromise is necessary. And perhaps for those reasons, it's losing grounds in terms of popularity. It seems so much easier to have some sort of authoritarian power simply telling us what to do. We don't have to make decisions. We're not necessarily good at making decisions. And it's sometimes difficult when you're faced with the decision not between something that's simply good on the one hand and bad on the other, but that has good elements on bad elements on both sides. Making decisions is not easy, and if we can avoid them, we will. Having someone tell us what to do seems attractive until they're telling us something that we really don't want to hear, that we really don't want to do. Then you foment, revolution, rebellion, and so on, and democracy reasserts itself for a time before sometimes falling back into some kind of authoritarianism. I'm not sure what the answer to this is. I suppose it is the best amongst a whole lot of bad systems. I think it works better in Australia than it does in some other countries in the world. I think we have a more balanced system here, but I grew up with that. It's really just my personal opinion, and others might have different ones. But democracy is certainly under threat at the moment, and the appeal of totalitarianism, authoritarianism is obvious today. I think we do have to struggle against that. It's kind of pushed, democracy is pushed from both sides. It's pushed from the authoritarian side, which wants to see the will of a few imposed on the will of the many, and also from the more libertarian, the personal liberty side, where people don't want to be told what to do by anybody anytime. And democracy also always implies being told what to do if it's only by a majority. And I think it's fair to say that the majority is not always right. And so that's why sometimes in things like referenda, you need a kind of super majority rather than just a simple majority. So majorities are not always right, but I don't think that necessarily gives minorities the right to impose their view on the rest of society either. If you can come up with a better system, let me know in the comments down there. We've got to find a way to do it. We'll keep on trying to find a way to do it, but let's not stop trying to find a way to do it. Let's not start down that slippery road towards authoritarianism, towards totalitarianism, which so often looks like the easy way. Progress terrifies people, doesn't it? People really don't like to change very much. At least it seems to me that most people don't. They like the familiarity of what they know, what they've become comfortable with, better the enemy you know, etc., etc. Now, change is not always progress. Even what we sometimes label as progress is not always progress. But we have made a lot of progress in a lot of areas over the years, some of them scientific, technological, some of them maybe ethically, morally. Sometimes the progress we've made is easily lost. I think you can lose ground fairly quickly, yeah, particularly in the areas of morality and ethics and freedom and equality, all those sorts of things. Those kinds of progress are very fragile. And again, many people find them threatening. And what's progress to one person is seen as a threat and dangerous uh, by others. That's particularly true if progress means that we may lose something while others may gain something. Of course, that can happen. And again, it's something that for a functioning society is from time to time going to have to happen. In terms of more technological progress, there are always people who are terrified by that as well. Change has always been resisted down through the centuries, and it still is. And it's fair to say that ethics and morality sometimes lag behind our progress in technology. But many of the things that we take for granted today were resisted in their time. And some of the things that were regarded as progress at the time have perhaps not necessarily turned out to be so in the long run. I think probably looking back, for example, over the course of the development of the car and the petrol engine, the internal combustion engine, and so on, around the same time that the internal combustion engine was being developed, there were considerable advances in the use of electric motors for vehicles, for example. But petrol oil was so cheap and so readily available that it became the one that we began to rely on. We could have had electric vehicles for over 100 years now, and we would probably not be facing some of the problems that we're facing now. But that's hindsight. At the time, what seemed like progress perhaps wasn't as progressive as we thought it was. And that's true of many things. I think during my lifetime, I've seen a lot of progress. So I was born in 1957, which was the year that Sputnik was launched. So it's kind of the start of the space era. There have been a lot of developments in technology since then, particularly in the area of computers and IT. We're going through a period now where we're facing the emergence of what people are calling AI, which I don't think is there yet, but people are calling it AI. And clearly, that's a kind of progress. It brings a lot of benefits, but like all these things, it brings potential dangers as well. I guess one of the themes that's recurring here is the need for balance and the recognition that there are not absolutes, that progress comes with a cost. Sometimes that cost is worth paying. Sometimes we'll pay it for a while, but then we'll realize we're going to have to do something else because the cost is too great. But that is also progress. I don't think many of us would do away with the medical progress that we've made, or even many of the technological and computer advances that have been made. I don't want to go back to having to handwrite books. I'm glad we developed typewriters and subsequently word processors and now computers and voice to text and all those things. Of course, there are some things we don't want to lose in the process, and we should hold on to them. But I generally like progress while being aware of some of the inherent dangers in each step of progress. And we do need to try to keep pace with the ethical questions that arise, although some of them don't become apparent until the new advancement has become well and truly entrenched in society. But I, for one, don't really want to turn back the clock. Tolerance. This is another difficult one, isn't it? And I guess if you look back over the video, you'll see that a lot of these principles, these Enlightenment principles, are in fact very difficult. And it's not surprising that we struggle with them even today. Tolerance is particularly problematic at the moment, I think. Probably around the time of the Enlightenment, which is maybe why the issue came up at all, cultures began to meet in ways that they had never done before. And since then, the world has simply shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And now different cultures rub against each other. Many different cultures inhabit the same place. And there's often different religious beliefs, different beliefs of all kinds, different practices within each of these cultures that don't necessarily sit well with other cultures. So, this meeting of cultures has really given rise to this question of tolerance. How do we handle this meeting of cultures? It's sometimes very difficult because people's beliefs are deeply held and their traditions are long standing, and it's not as if they're going to simply give them away. Which is why I suppose that tolerance of other cultures becomes necessary. We can't simply impose our values on everyone else. And I think that's probably part of the problem today with Western culture and why there's a reaction against it in some areas, because it's perceived that Western culture has become too dominant, that it's imposing its values, its belief system on other parts of the world. And what we in Western culture take for granted. Indeed, some of the values we've been discussing, like personal liberty, um, progress, reason, even tolerance itself, these are not necessarily values that are shared within every culture. So, how does a society which values tolerance, or at least claims to value tolerance, deal with cultures which don't? Are we tolerant of intolerance? I know I'm not the first person to ask that question, but it's really one of the things at the heart of the problem, isn't it? How tolerant can we be? If our values say that liberty is important, then how do we deal with a society which doesn't? If human life is important in our society, if we see that as the protection of human life as something important, how do we deal with a culture which doesn't, if tolerance is also one of our values? Do we just mean that other people have to be tolerant of our views, or are we going to be tolerant of theirs too? This is another huge area for which there are no simple answers. I mean, we're paying the price for that in so many ways today. When we talk about society today, we're not just talking about a particular group of people in a particular geographical location. Perhaps in a small area, in small groups, tolerance may work, although there's considerable evidence to suggest that it doesn't. But what we're talking about now is actually a global community. We are completely interlocked in this world with societies that are very different. Societies that are very different from the society in which I live. And yet we depend upon each other. We interact with each other all the time. In some respects, we cooperate with each other. In other respects, we're in conflict. But we cannot separate ourselves from these other cultures. We cannot become isolationist. Australia first doesn't work. I think when we say Australia first, we mean probably Australia only rather than an Australia first. But in a global society, which is what we have now, sometimes tolerance, even of the intolerable, becomes necessary. And it's a very difficult price to pay. It's not just the price we pay for our own welfare. We're not just being tolerant of other societies which perhaps believe and do things that we don't do and don't believe in. It's not just for our own good, but really today it's for the welfare and benefit of the entire planet, the entire world community. We're wrestling with that. We're not doing a great job of it. Sometimes tolerance means compromising some of your own values. Not that you don't still apply those values to your own society, to your own culture, to yourself, but you do sometimes have to recognize that it's necessary to accept other people's way of life, even when we strongly disagree with it and strongly oppose it. That's not easy to do, but it's probably necessary for our survival. So, from that point of view, tolerance becomes not so much something that we value, but something that we have to endure, something that we have to live with, sometimes despite our other values. That's not to say that we don't also hope from within our own value system that our values that we think are right and proper will spread throughout the world. They they may not. But just for the sake of survival, we have to be able to tolerate even some things that are intolerable. And sometimes we have to not tolerate things that are intolerable. And unfortunately, that leads to conflict and even to war. There's nothing easy about this. There never has been. There never will be. So there we have it. A difficult topic with no easy answers. It's probably worth remembering, however, that the USA, for example, is actually founded upon the principles of the Enlightenment and not upon any particular position of faith or religion. So we need to know these principles, we need to remember these principles. They're really important today, as they always were. Well, at least think about it.